there is a mathematical way of calculating depth of field and the hyperfocal distance. I found a very good website, Depth of Field Mastery here, that has these equations here for the hyperfocal distance, the near distance of acceptable sharpness, and the far distance of acceptable sharpness. The near distance and the far distance are the distances between your subject and perfect sharp focus. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail as with the equation here, but I'm going to talk about the relative factors involved with this equation here. It says where h is the hyperfocal distance. The hyperfocal distance is where your subject is in perfect focus and every single thing behind your subject is in perfect focus all the way to infinity. There is a distance you can get to your subject where okay, let me say it a different way. The hyperfocal distance is the closest possible distance you can get to your subject and have absolutely everything behind the subject to infinity in perfect focus. When you stand back far enough from your subject, there is a distance where, you know, every lens, every camera will have this hyperfocal distance if you're back far enough. But it's good to know your hyperfocal distance because it tells you how close you can get to your subject and achieve that. So h is the hyperfocal distance. F is the lens focal length in millimeters. So, you know, if you're using a wide angle lens or, you know, portrait lens, you know, 55 millimeter, 100 millimeter. So this is your lens focal length here. This is a variable that you have control over by changing your lens. So S is the focus distance. This is another variable that you have control over by distancing yourself from your subject. So it has d to the end is the near distance for acceptable sharpness. So here we're talking about your depth of field. When you have a depth of field, you know, you have your subject in perfect focus, but you have also a range in front of the subject and a range behind the subject, and these are different distances. They're not equal distances. So d to the end is the near distance for acceptable sharpness. This is in front of your subject. D to the f is the far distance for acceptable sharpness. How much distance behind the subject is in focus. And this is important because when you're creating your shots and you are having some of your subject in some of your picture is in focus and some of your picture is out of focus. For example, if you are positioning people at different planes and you want them, if you want some people in focus and you want some people out of focus or some subjects out of focus, this is very important for positioning objects in your composition here. N is the f number. This is something you have control over. You can change your aperture, your f number. When you increase the aperture, which is a lower f number, you're also decreasing the depth of field. When you make the aperture extremely small, this is creating a larger depth of field and more of your picture is going to be in focus. So C is the circle of confusion here. I'm not going to explain a lot of it. I don't understand it totally myself. It has to do with where the light rays converge as they enter into the lens of the camera before the image is flipped. This is a constant value. It's extremely small. It's about, it says it's in millimeters here, but it's approximately 1 millimeter divided by 50. So that's, you know, how extremely small this circle of confusion is. But it's an essential value in the equation for calculating your hyperfocal distance and your depth of field. The value for the circle of confusion will change with your sensor dimensions. It's in a, if you're using a crop sensor or if you're using a full frame sensor, these are relative values, and the circle of confusion values will change relative to the sensor size here. There is an app for calculating the hyperfocal distance and your depth of field, which will save you the trouble of you know, even bothering with this equation at all here. The name of the app is called Hyperfocal Pro. It's a free app, and I completely recommend downloading it. It completely changed my photography and opened my eyes to a lot of things. What I did is I took the values using the Hyperfocal Pro app, and I made charts of the data here, and I'm going to explain these charts here. I've got two cameras. I've got a full sensor D750 Nikon and a crop sensor D5300 here. So the crop sensor has a dimension of 23.5 millimeters by 15.6 millimeters, and the circle of confusion 0.01888 millimeters. The full sensor dimensions 35.9 millimeters by 24 millimeters, and the circle of confusion is slightly larger here. So I've got this Excel file here, and I'm gonna post a link so that you can download it for yourself, and it might save you a lot of time if your sensor is close to these values. Then these figures should be extremely close to whatever your camera is. I made these charts for different lenses: 11 millimeter lens, 20 milliliter lens, 35 millimeter, 50 millimeter, 85 millimeter, and 105 millimeters. And I did all the values in centimeters, depth of field in centimeters. So all these values under the lenses are all recorded in centimeters, whether it's 2.6 centimeters, 0.1 centimeters, so that's 1 millimeter, you know, to 889 centimeters, which is almost 9 meters. It's the only way I could, you know, keep a consistent, you know, I didn't want to change millimeters to meters and centimeters. They're all, everything's in centimeters here. On the left side here, I've got the distance I am from my subject. For example, the first one here, I'm 1/4 of a meter distance from my subject. Extremely close. and my aperture value is f1.4. So everything in the first section here, I've got the same aperture at 1.4, but I'm standing different distances. All the way from 20 meters, 10 meters, 3 meters, 2 meters, 1 meters, to 1/4 of a meter from my subject. And then in the next section here, the only thing I change is my aperture. Here I have all the different distances that I did the first one, but I'm changing my f-stop here to 2.8. In the next section, I change the f-stop to f4. So I'm making the aperture smaller here, and I'm comparing how all these values work for the various lenses here. From my f4, I jump to f8, and then I jump to f22. So, it gives you a sort of a clear range, standing between 20 meters and 1/4 of a meter from your subject, and using a f-stop range of 1.4 all the way to f22. If you look at my chart, this is okay. So this page here is looking at depth of field. This isn't looking at the hyperfocal distance. It's looking at depth of field. But you notice, for example, the 11 millimeter here starts at 2.6. The values increase up to 693, and then it jumps to infinity. So that means the hyperfocal distance has been reached, where you're no longer dealing with a depth of field, because everything is in focus behind the subject. So I'm going to show you the next page here. Depth of field percentage here. Now, what I did here in this chart is I took the same chart from here, but I split it apart between the lenses here, and I added percentage front and percentage behind. Now this is the near focal distance and the far focal distance. Instead of putting actual values, I put percentage. So looking at 11 millimeters, there's a depth of field of 4 centimeters, but this 4 centimeters is distributed. 46% of this 4 centimeters is in front, and 54% of the acceptable focus range is behind your subject in perfect focus. You'll notice beside the infinity symbol, there's a value here in meters. This, which is, the rest of the chart is in centimeters, but for example here, this infinity value, beside it there's a 1.5 meters. This is called the near limit. The near limit is I'll explain it different here. The depth of field, I'm going to get this closer here. I should be using a larger cursor. Okay, so at 3 meters and an f1.4, I'm standing 3 meters from my subject in focus. Everything's in subject to infinity, which means I've reached my hyperfocal distance. But 1.5 meters is, though I'm standing 3 meters from my subject, Everything from 1.5 meters is actually in acceptable focus. And here you see the next one at 10 meters. Even though I'm 10 meters from my subject, everything 2.3 meters in front of me is in focus. So 2.3 meters, which is over 7 meters in front of my subject, 10 meters away, is all in focus. These values are all on the app called Hyperfocal Pro. It will tell you all these focus distances, which are extremely helpful in constructing your shots. So you'll notice that the distribution changes of the acceptable range of focus in front and behind as you get closer and farther from your subject, and as you change your lenses. As you change from a wide angle from 11 millimeters all the way to 105 millimeters, you can see that the percentage of in front and behind becomes more equal. There's more even distribution. It's very interesting to compare these values. I'm going to show you where this is where I where I charted all the hyperfocal values here for both my cameras. So this is hyperfocal in meters. This is not centimeters. These values are all in meters. And what I did is I did different f-stops. So here it's not really relative where you're standing from your subject, because it's telling you what your hyperfocal distance is regardless. Your f-stop from 1.0 all the way to f64, which I'm sure your lens is not even going to go to that point here. Let me see here. What I have in green here is just specific for my camera lenses. These are what my aperture value lenses these are what my range of aperture values for my specific lenses. My wide angle will only perform between 2.8 and f22, so I highlighted this in green. And my 105 millimeter will only go between 2.8 and f22. My 85 millimeter lens will work actually between 1.8, but I couldn't. The app didn't have the values for 1.8, so I sort of have to guesstimate by looking at the values above and below, which, you know, I can get a pretty good estimate based on how these values are climbing or decreasing. I also took all these values and I put them in a graph. I invite you to do the same if you're really ambitious to see the relationship between these values, and you will see there is a very direct pattern to all these values. You can also create different maps in Excel. I started to do one here. Let's see, try to get this the right distance so you can see it. showing the hyperfocal distance for the lenses. You can see there's definitely a mathematical pattern for how these hyperfocal distances change here for these different lenses. Anyways, I hope that you can make use of these values as much as I did. Again, the name of the app is called Hyperfocal Pro. It's an incredible app, and I hope you enjoy your photography.